Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for joining us. Today's conversation in this series of programs on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. The user-supported channel brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. You can also listen to these programs as podcasts on your favorite platform. Empires come and empires go. Just look at world history, says Alan Friedman, best-selling journalist in his new book, The End of America, A Guide to a New World Disorder. Is this true? This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and to discuss this headline question, my guests today are two well-known historians, Professor Hugh Liebert and Scott Silverstone from the United States Military Academy at West Point, one of the world's most renowned military organizations, or schools, I should say. Dr. Hugh Liebert is Professor of American Politics in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, New York, where he teaches courses in political philosophy, American politics, civil-military relations. He also serves as director of West Point's Graduate Scholarship Program and is the author and editor of 7 books, including Gibbon's Christianity and Plutarch's Politics, which won the Delba Winthrop Award for Excellence in Political Science. Dr. Scott Silverstone, Professor of International Relations at West Point, where he has served on the faculty since 2001. Early in his career, he was a naval officer flying for an anti-submarine warfare squadron in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and serving as a crisis staff officer in the Pentagon. He is the author of 4 books and is currently writing a book on the origins of the ancient Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century. Both Professors Liebert and Silverstone appear in a personal capacity on Polaris-Live today, and their views don't necessarily reflect those of the US Military Academy or the Department of Defense. Ray Dalio, perhaps the most successful Wall Street fund manager, has noted that the main difference between Imperial Rome and America is the extraordinary brevity of the American empire that has gone from global hegemony to today's seeming national disorder in less than half a century. Both of you are among the country's best historians of geopolitical cycles, including Rome, Sparta, Athens, others. Do you see any historical similarities, some flashing red lights that would point to America being on a downward slope from its pinnacle of power? So let's start with you, Scott, and then Hugh, you can chime in.
Good morning, Sarwar. Thanks for having me on the show. Well, the first response to the question, there's a couple of key words that are in there, and I'm going to take exception to using the word empire. For the United States, I'm going to use the word hegemony or hegemon. It was built into Ray Dalio's observation. And frankly, I think it's more accurate. It's a more interesting and useful term for us to think about. And I want to twist the question around because when we compare the United States to long-term empires like Rome, I mean, Rome is going to be hard to beat in terms of the kind of endurance, longevity of their rule over the parts of the world that they controlled. When we think about the United States as a hegemon, frankly, I'm looking at the United States as a success story. And I think we need to appreciate the origins, the sources of American success in terms of being a hegemon. So let me just define the word briefly. When we talk about a hegemon, we're really talking about a dominant state within a particular part of the world. They have a leading role in terms of material power, and they have a central role in actually shaping the rules and expectations for the behavior of other key actors, other secondary states within the system. And if we look at other hegemons in the modern state system, other countries that aspire to play this central role, they've all had very violent ends. We think about Napoleonic France. We think about Germany, early 20th century Germany under the Nazis. We think about Imperial Japan. These are hegemonic aspirants that their brutal tactics actually produced a counterbalance and led to their collapse. The Soviets had their own hegemonic sphere for a time. We saw how fragile that was. And the Athenian Empire, which of course is the case I'm working on now, had about a good 50-year run as a dominant state within the Aegean Sea, but we saw how fragile their rule was. The United States, and I'll wrap up on this observation, the key to American success in terms of being a hegemon as long as we have is based on legitimacy, based on acceptance by our partner states in the character of the rules, in providing voice in terms of how the order that we're all a part of was actually going to be run, providing goods that they would benefit from, and then gladly accept American leadership. So I think we should look to the United States really as an outlier in terms of the history of states that have pursued hegemony.
Thank you. Hugh?
Thanks, Sarwar. It's a real delight to be with you this morning, and it's especially a treat to get to appear alongside my dear colleague, Scott Silverstone. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So just to begin, I think everything Scott said about thinking of the United States as a hegemon, as distinct from an empire, is exactly right. I will say that one thing I really value, though, from Ray Dalio's formulation, you mentioned Friedman. We might also mention Graham Allison and others who have brought up these theories of powers rising, reaching a kind of peak and then declining and falling. Is I think it puts the cyclical theory of history back on the table in a way that, to my mind, is a very useful contribution. After the Cold War, we were debating back and forth a very powerful and influential theory of history that had a different shape to it, a progressive theory of history, a view of history where we could imagine history ending or reaching a kind of permanent peak. We have, I think, now a little bit more humility about the shape of history, one that forces us to confront the possibility that in fact we will fall at some point. All great powers that we've known in history have. And to my mind, that's a very useful contribution, not only as a theory of history, which might be true, but also just as a way of keeping oneself intellectually honest and facing up to challenges, recognizing the red lights as well as the green lights. Just to conclude that thought, there's one passage that I really, from the Roman historian, Greek historian, Polybius, as a writer in Greek who's trying to understand how Rome rose, in such a short period of time to conquer the world. Yes. But he tells the story towards the end of his history of being with Scipio Africanus when Scipio finally defeated Carthage in 146 and was watching Carthage burn. And he turns to Polybius. Polybius says, this is a beautiful sight, but at some point in the future, I fear this will be Rome too. And Polybius says there has never been a more statesmanlike and a more astute, smarter, wiser comment than that. I think that's exactly right. And you recognize, I think, a nation's strengths and weaknesses by contemplating its fall. That's a very good thing for us to do.
So both of you seem to be saying that there really are no flashing orange or red lights that might, from a historical perspective, warn us about the future progress trajectory of the American hegemon. And thank you for correcting me, Scott. That's why I get experts like you, because I'm so full of erroneous ideas that people correct me all the time. I appreciate that a great deal. So, but so you're saying there really are no orange or red flashing lights that come up from your study of the historical hegemons or empires in the Rome's case that can warn us now to alter course. You don't see anything like that happening.
Well, I would think about like I said before, the sources of American success has really been rooted in legitimacy. It's been the acceptance of all those states that have seen a role in an American-centered order based on the rules, the rights, the the privileges that are offered by being a compliant member and participant in this order. So when we think about flashing red lights, I think about the sources of fragility. What are the sources that lead those within, whether it's an imperial or a hegemonic order, to begin to question why is it that we are accepting the rule of this central state? Why is it that we are compliant with expectations? What is it that we're actually getting from this relationship? It has to be a two-way street. So to the degree that we think about the perspective of our partner states, of our allies, we can't remove them from the equation. If we value this role that America has played really since 1945, much longer than the half century that Ray Dalio talks about, it really is going to stand or fall. A hegemonic order, it's going to stand or fall based on the response of secondary states. Now, we could turn this into a true empire and begin to use much more extractive strategies to maintain compliance. But that would be a fundamentally different character than what we've seen as the character of the American hegemonic order since 1945.
And Hugh, I'm going to let you get into this conversation, but let me throw in one more piece that if you could please consider. I think both of you are saying rightly so that a hegemon, I mean, America is a success story because we've earned our place in the world. It doesn't just happen. It's been hard work for decades. So the point I want to throw in is the American people now seem to be, if I may say, a little bit impatient and tired of that earning, quote unquote. We are looking inward. The last election kind of brought out some of the views of the American people. It's more nationalistic, saying, hey, we might have done too much. We need to be looking at ourselves. Some of the allies that you mentioned, Scott, how important their position is, they seem to be kind of moving over to the side as we go through this mini trajectory, if you will. How do you put that together? Scott, let me throw that into Hugh, and then I'll let you come in. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Well, so how do I put together the sense of kind of weariness, of retrenchment that we see maybe emerging in American public opinion, with some of the theories of great powers rising and falling that we, have ready to hand?
Right.
I'd say it's very hard to know. I mean, when we think of like the dominant theories of how powers rise and fall, we might say there are two, big theories, right? One is a cyclical theory, the other is a progressive theory. But as a critique of both of those theories, you can always present history as, one damn thing after another that has no shape to it at all, right? And each of those three, I think, has some plausibility at different points in history. It's very hard to know, though, when applying either the universal theory or the cyclical theory, exactly where you are, whether you're in a moment of retrenchment or in a moment of decline. And it's only, I think, in hindsight, this is why we're talking mainly in a historical vein, that it's easy to kind of piece together the different data, into the different moments into something that looks like a coherent theory. So all of that is to say, what's going on right now? Well, I think it could either be a moment of, maybe decline that fits Ray Dalio's, worries, or, and I think this is the most hopeful take, a moment of retrenchment and renewal, where Americans try to face up to the possibility of imperial overreach, of some extensions maybe, and commitments that can't fully be lived up to, and try to rebalance themselves for a new period in their development. If that were true, it wouldn't be a moment in decline, it might be a moment on the ascent.
Yes, a strengthening, if you will. Please, Scott.
Yeah, this is a great question. And frankly, it's not surprising that we are seeing stress in terms of at the popular level, even among the business community and political elites, a questioning of the commitments and the cost that America has borne for so long. And what's so interesting about this moment in time, and Hugh's right, we don't know if we're in a period of decline or retrenchment and a readjustment while maintaining the essence of America's role in the world. This role that we have, frankly, has been forgotten. Like, what is the value proposition for this position that America has paid a lot to sustain over 80 years?
Yes.
And we are several generations beyond those who have living memory of the early and mid 20th century, these horrific moments in which two great world wars, a Great Depression, leads American leaders to develop what really at the time were radical ideas about the essential dysfunction of the global order, the changes in technology that made American isolationism and these two beautiful moats we call the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and being able to hunker down in the Western Hemisphere as good enough to secure American territory and our population, to maintain economic prosperity. These were hard-won lessons. So the idea of an American hegemony and the character of American hegemony is born at a particular historical moment in time. That is 8 years. You know, it won't be too long before we mark the centennial of the end of World War II. How do you refresh within the American population, as the American population grows older, as new generations are born? How do you educate them to, this is why we do this? And if we can't make the value proposition any longer, if it feels ancient to younger generations, then you're going to have this kind of stress at the domestic level in terms of why are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah, Sarwar, can I speak to that really quick? Because I think Scott framed that very well. And I think just quickly, one lesson I think we take from many of the classic statements of the rise and the fall, of empires is thinking about the relationship between economic capacity and then commitments overseas. So one way to frame the question that Scott asks is, as a matter of will, right, on one hand, do we have the will and understand the reason such that we can commit ourselves to playing something like the role we have since the end of World War II? Another way of framing it is the question of capacity, right? Given that we would, even if we wanted to, right, extend power in something like we did, after World War II, right? Yes. Can we sustain that economically anymore? And I think there are very reasonable questions being brought up now. I mean, it's just, I think the case that the capacity of the American economy to support commitments overseas has changed over time. Was at a kind of peak at the end of World War II, when a lot of the institutions Scott's describing, were brought into being, and is less relative to the rest of the globe now than it was back then.
So it seems as though both of you, if I may underline this word, earn. That you have to earn your position in the world as a hegemon, as a leader, and so on. And I wanted to ask you, how much of that has to do with uniformity of population, for example? I mean, the Roman Empire was largely comprised of folks who looked alike and who were part of this. Am I right about that? Is part of the growth of America and the strength of America and the attraction of America is the diversity now versus, when we started the American experiment. Do you think that diverse populations have anything to do with this equation? Either of you?
I think it's a hard question to answer.
Yes.
Frankly, because the United States was founded on an idea, and the ideas that come out of World War II in terms of how the United States can actually make the world less dysfunctional, reduce the likelihood of great power conflict, increase prosperity for all peoples. These are general ideas that, regardless of the diversity of your population, if the logic makes sense, then you should be able to make the case. You have to be able to make the case. So I don't see anything inherent in a more diverse population if they understand the value proposition in terms of what is the payback for the United States for the American population, regardless of who's here,
Right.
in terms of a more peaceful world, a more prosperous world.
So Hugh, you probably want to chime in, but I had a question that I was saving for you. What were some of the reasons for the huge Roman Empire's collapse? I mean, decaying leadership, hubris. Just fill us in, will you?
All right, I thought you'd never ask.
I know your master Gibbons has written 6 volumes on this, and so, but we only have a few minutes. But give it a shot, will you?
Yeah, I can distill it to a couple of hours. It'll be easy to do. Yeah. So, no, listen, all of the things you said, all of the above is the right answer. I mean, there's no shortage of causes of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, there's a book that historians of this period like to cite. It came out in the mid 80s by this very influential German historian that kind of tallied all of the potential causes and came up with 210 of them that different historians have identified. Being lead poisoning. That's my favorite of them.
Lead poisoning.
Gibbon doesn't talk about lead poisoning. So just a quick refresher to everyone. Edward Gibbon is writing in the second half of the 18th century. Writes a great book in many different respects of the word great. It's very large for one, 3,000 pages, weighs over 20 pounds in the most common edition. It's very big. It was published over a long period of time. First came out in 1776. Last volumes came out in 1788. But great also in a more fundamental sense, that it has an enduring theory of a very important historical development. What is that theory? Basically, that Gibbon says that the decline and fall of Rome came about as the natural and inevitable effect of a moderate greatness. That's what he says.
Wow.
He explains by saying that,
Tell us that. Yeah. Give us that line again, Hugh.
So he says the decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of a moderate greatness. And Sarwar, I have to say, I hope I will inspire everyone to go read every page of this wonderful book. But the line I'm quoting comes from a small text called "The General Observations on the Decline and Fall of Rome in the West," which Gibbon put as the coda to the third of these 6 volumes he published. So it's a little bit funny reading, at the end of this, that the cause is actually very straightforward. After reading 1,500 pages, very straightforward, right? It's just a moderate greatness. And he explains that what he means by that, he says, is that prosperity ripens the principle of decay. So there's something about the prosperity of Rome that leads to its decline. And he also says that as it extended its empire, the potential causes of the military collapse increased in number. The bigger the frontier gets, the easier it is for some conflict out there to have a kind of ripple effect that redounds to the whole and makes the whole thing fall apart. Now, that second idea, that there's something about military overextension that can no longer be supported back home, is a very common idea in contemporary reflections on what leads to the decline and fall of empires. Paul Kennedy, for instance, made it very famous in his 1987 book on that theme. The first idea, that prosperity has something to do with it, to my mind, is the more interesting and provocative of them, because it suggests to us that actually there's something about being rich and powerful in and of itself that makes it very hard to maintain the commitments and virtues that you need to remain powerful. And that's a very, very old idea, but Gibbon put a particularly provocative and kind of compelling spin on it, I think. So that's definitely something we can kind of take from his work and wrestle with.
Thank you for that. Let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live is totally commercial free and entirely viewer supported. So we'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com and to our YouTube channel, www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost associated with it, and it really does help us. And of course, we always welcome your comments on our video and podcast channel. Listen, my wife is a great reader of history. And she said she would love if she was on this, which she's not allowed to do. But she said, if I was to be there, I would like to ask these 2 gentlemen, you study history over long periods of time. And she said, so now we are living in an interconnected age. Things happen overnight. Everyone is connected. They know what's happening. Has your discipline changed any from historians in the past? I thought that would be a really nice question to throw out to you two.
It's a great question. And clearly, political scientists are studying politics, political behavior across different contexts, different historical contexts, different places in the world, different kinds of questions that we ask. I'm a very historically oriented international relations scholar. I love searching for more generalizable ways of understanding politics, understanding war, power, security, leadership, strategy. I love to plumb the depths of history. It takes me out of the white noise. Frankly, we are in a period of information overload. So, part of your wife's question, which is about information that flows at such dynamic speeds now, oftentimes obscures what's happening underneath, the interesting trends, patterns, parallels that I'm really interested in exploring. So the way I look at this, and now I'm teaching West Point cadets, they're going to be Army officers going into the 21st century as they march out of here. So I have to make my teaching and my research and my writing relevant, even when it's historically oriented. So the way I address this question of the modern moment and our experience day to day of our lives, of world politics, is I am looking for those enduring features of human beings, those enduring features of behavior in large groups, behavior by sovereign state actors. And we can find these enduring lessons. This is why I love to go back to my man Thucydides, ancient Athenian historian who left behind this amazing work, in my mind, the most important historical work on great power politics that's ever been produced. And of course, he's writing about the 5th century BC. He's writing about ancient Athens and Sparta and the respective empires, leagues, and this great war between them. And Thucydides says it right up front. He says, human nature being what it is, the events that occurred in this war are going to occur again, which is why I love to go back to it, which is why I love to expose my students to this history. And regardless of all of the amazing technological changes that we're living through, some promising, some very frightening, we're still human beings. And to me, it boils down to the way Thucydides essentially said there's the 3 most important motives for behavior are fear, honor, and interest. Interest defined as profit. And they have such resonance regardless of what historical time period you're talking about. So to me, I like to think about how do contemporary events, how do the details, the technological, economic, social, geographic details of this moment impact human beings in terms of the way they fear, the way they're motivated by honor and respect, and their pursuit of security and prosperity. And those things don't change. And those lessons that we can pull forward from 2,500 years ago still are sources of wisdom.
So, Hugh, you agree with that?
I couldn't agree more with that, Sarwar. Scott put it beautifully.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Except to say that the temptation of not to challenge Scott's correct opinion increases with the rate of technological change.
Yes.
So all the more important for us now, where it seems technology is changing so rapidly and changing what we do as political scientists who are thinking about history, all the more do we have to insist that certain issues are perennial. And we can return to people like Thucydides, who wrote possessions for all time, and take them seriously as possessions for all time.
So are you two telling me that that because of this continuity in what you do, that the way that you teach at West Point has not really dramatically changed? If you look at just the last 2 decades or so, we've gone through an upheaval in country relations, in the leadership of countries and so on. Has your teaching and elements you drive home to future officers to build their perspective, or to let them have the background to build their perspective, have these changed at all? Is your teaching now has the same points that it did 20 years ago, let's say?
I'm going to
start
go
with you,
first.
and then Scott, if you'd like to weigh in.
Yeah, I'll go first because Scott has the reputation of being one of the most innovative and impactful educators that we have at West Point. I, on the other hand, am a Luddite. I stick to the perennial things and then try as much as possible not to change in the education I offer my cadets. So Scott will probably give the more favorable impression of the institution, so he should speak second. So the way I think about this, Sarwar, is that the mission of West Point is to educate, train, build, and inspire leaders of character. I don't think the fundamentals of what that mission is and how it's achieved has changed significantly since West Point has been founded. I think the fundamental instruments we have for shaping character are the same, now as they were several centuries ago, maybe millennia ago. As a result, I don't think necessarily that, at least when you're teaching, fundamental questions of character, of including the kind of intellectual character, the ability to have intellectual virtues so that you can see the strategic significance and opportunities, in the situation that you confront in front of you. All of those things seem to me quite perennial, in such a way that, that it's good for the institution as a whole for West Point to include, my colleagues who I treasure over in the engineering departments and computer science who are, figuring out how to make robot dogs, effective instruments on the battlefield and how to man drones. I'm very, very, we absolutely need that. But we also need people who are focused on the eternal elements of character, intelligence, and are using texts like Thucydides and Gibbon to train for those kinds of virtues. So no, my education hasn't changed too much, but Scott's has. And so I'll turn it over to Scott.
Hey, Scott, as you pursue this line, I'll throw out one mini question also. And that has to do with the corollaries. Has the perspective of today's incoming freshmen to West Point changed? So
these are such important questions, Sarwar, and thanks, Hugh, for your kind words. So I'll take on both of those questions by just starting with an observation about my timeline here at West Point. I was hired in the late spring of 2001. And we start our semesters early. We begin in mid-August. So think about this. It's August of 2001. Wow. And I'm in the classroom, my first semester at West Point. It is classic 1990s style international relations that I'm teaching, post-Cold War framework, the kind of things that America had been doing during the 1990s. 3 weeks into my very first semester at West Point, we're hit on 9/11. So everything the country and the Army has been through, and the Army has been through so much since 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Afghanistan again, Syria. Now it's great power politics on the eastern frontier in Europe, worrying about great power war in the Western Pacific. And to be a scholar of international relations and security studies during this particular moment in American history has been total serendipity. But boy, I could not have asked for greater blessings, frankly, in terms of being able to learn along with my colleagues, to experience what it would be like, what it is like to be at a military academy in a time of war, as long as that's been. And as you mentioned, things have changed in terms of the problem set that our cadets confront. And I'm 100% with you. There are enduring intellectual and character-rooted elements of what we try to develop in our cadets, that what we do develop in our cadets, that have to be enduring. And we're all part of that larger mission. And what I noticed in the early years after 9/11, particularly when we have young graduates, platoon leaders, young company commanders who are representative of American power at the village level in Afghanistan, in Iraq, controlling immense amounts of power at their beck and call, feeling completely out of their depths from culture shock and taking on this incredibly complex nation building and counterinsurgency mission we did a lot of headline chasing. We're getting, in those days in our curriculum, we're getting reports from the field that it's just so challenging, and there are things that our graduates are missing in terms of cultural preparation to deal with people very different from them. So we made a lot of changes to the curriculum that were very much about preparing 22-year-olds, 24-year-olds to be at the tip of the spear in these very different places. But of course, the world has continued to change. So we don't chase headlines as much anymore. It's sort of rerouted in the enduring intellectual and character attributes that he was talking about that you get from a rigorous liberal arts education across humanities, social sciences, and the STEM fields. That is the core of what we can provide them. That is going to be the enduring foundation for their success as U.S. Army officers. The one major thing that I have changed in my curriculum is really based on a lot of the problems that we have had, despite immense material advantages when the United States goes abroad and takes on the kind of missions that we have. I have worked into my capstone course. The central focus is on power. So our international affairs cadets are getting a heavy dose of the very meaning of power in politics. And we're defining it not as material resources, economic, military, territorial resources. We're defining power as what you can actually accomplish with the resources and the strategic logic that you bring to bear. Because I've noticed a tremendous gap in what America has in terms of a resource base and why we don't accomplish the strategic objectives that we set out to accomplish. So I've made that a very purposeful part of my contribution to the international affairs program, is to get cadets to appreciate that material power does not translate automatically the way many Americans expect it to into the complex outcomes that we're trying to accomplish.
So let me by the way, I should point out that we are now heading into the second half hour of our conversation, which is fine because I think the topic we are talking about, I hope both of you will agree, is probably the headline topic that we're looking at today in the newspapers and elsewhere. And I want to go back just a little bit to the main focus, the main thrust of Polaris-Live, which is looking at the US-China relationship and its impact from around the world through the eyes of experts like you. The question I have is, and it ties into something that you just said, Scott, is, to my knowledge, America has never before faced a competitor the size and the depth of China, right? I mean, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, just to take the business model approach, the best year of trade with the Soviet Union, we do with China in one day, a whole year's worth of trade in the best year. So all of a sudden now we have people that look different from Europeans. They are eyeball to eyeball. Some would say, or the Pentagon the war games, in the South China Sea, America really prevails, as I recall. Is this something new for us to deal with? And is this one reason why we are going through so many iterations of questioning and so on? Hugh, let you do that, because it's got to have some effect on the mind of the incoming freshmen in West Point, I would think. At least I hope that they come in realizing that this isn't just a Soviet Union. This is a huge power. I'm reading today that BYD, the electric car manufacturer, which is running rings around Tesla now, they've just released yesterday a recharging protocol that lets you in 5 minutes get 400 miles out of your car. So that's the person that we're dealing with. And I'm asking you, is this a whole new paradigm that we need to now think about? Go ahead.
So one of the great values in like thinking through historical analogy is I think it sensitizes you to saying there's always something similar and there's always something different. And there's always points of analogy, always things that are disanalogous. On a point of analogy, I mean, you could say that this is an unprecedented challenge that we're facing, and in many respects, which you articulated eloquently, that would be correct. But you could also say, that going back to the period of the American founding, America was not always a great power. It always had potential, to be really exceptional. But when, the founders were thinking through the strategic challenges that the nation would face, they had the British Empire, which was far more powerful than they were, front and center. And not only did they have the practical problem of the British Empire in front of them, but they were all thinking about the Roman Empire. And so we're aware, of a much greater power than they felt themselves to be, although they anticipated, being quite powerful indeed. So I think in a way, I would say that the challenge we're facing now feels new because of how much our way of thinking about the world has been shaped by the strategic situation we faced at the end of World War II. I think if we go back to the roots of the country, though, it shouldn't feel altogether new. And we should be able to draw on some of the modes of thinking, and adapt them because it is disanalogous our own situation, right? But we should be able to adapt, those modes of thinking that have a long history in our country and develop some new ones too.
So, Scott, I'm going to chime in here and pretend that I'm a student asking a question in a classroom, and positions of hegemon have to be earned all the time. They need to keep a perspective of who they are, where they've come from, where they're going. And I would suppose how important relations with other countries are. I think you would both agree with those points. The question I, as a student, would like to ask is, as America seems to be reducing its ties to international organizations like the UN, for example, and this is discussing already shutting out visitors from a number of countries, removing foreign aid, the so-called soft power, as people term it. Do you think that other countries, I'm talking now of global South countries such as India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, and so on, that they start backing off? Do you think? And I'm just asking this as a general knowledge type of questions. So much of America's power and attraction was because of what these countries were thinking. And if we are now closing in on ourselves and starting to do these kinds of disconnections with international relations with other countries, do you think that's a good idea based on your background? And Scott, I'll let you go, and we'll start keeping our answers a little bit shorter now as we run into the second hour.
Well, I think if this is marking a trend, and what I'm going to take from the student's question that was posed in the classroom as really just a reflection of the current administration's vision that seems to be anomalous compared to post-World War II American engagement abroad, and this idea that America should rightfully be at the center of a hegemonic order, hegemonic in a much more limited geographic scope coming out of World War II. Our visions for how the geographic expanse of American hegemony really exploded after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. So clearly, just to go back to your earlier question and build on that in this particular moment in time, and different models for what America's vision of its place in the world might be. You're right. Your earlier question about China being fundamentally different than the Soviet Union, the Chinese can offer a lot more. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge if we see ourselves in some kind of a zero-sum competition for relationships that are based on political expectations, economic benefits, security implications. China has a lot more to offer in a number of those areas compared to the Soviet Union, so this is fundamentally a different challenger. What I'm seeing now is the emergence of potentially a very different vision, a much more spheres of influence vision of America and other great powers that, frankly, we sort of rejected coming out of World War II, despite the fact the Cold War was a sphere of influence, bipolar system in which the Soviets had their sphere, America had its sphere. We competed in the periphery in terms of others that might want to join one side or the other. But really, this idea that the liberal order could be almost global really flowered, from 1991 forward. So if that's our baseline, then this feels like a very different moment in time. And what we may be looking at is the emergence of this new idea that the Russians can have their sphere of influence, and we're going to renegotiate the distribution of territory in Eastern Europe to make the Russians happy, develop a new relationship with the Russians in which we're living side by side. America goes back to a Western Hemisphere that extends from dominance from Greenland through Canada, and then the Panama Canal through South America. Perhaps we'll pursue some kind of a modus vivendi with the Chinese and respect a Chinese sphere of influence and rules of the road, very much like Athens and Sparta had in the years leading up to the Peloponnesian War. That was a sphere of influence system that they negotiated about 13 years before the war broke out, with very explicit rules that kept both Sparta and Athens comfortable and content and out of each other's affairs. And this may be a new vision that we're seeing emerge.
Let me get to Hugh. And Hugh, I'm going to let you respond. And then I have a final question before we part, which is going to be very difficult because I could listen to you guys all day without a lunch break. So Scott, go ahead and do this, because I think this is really important, because as we are distancing ourselves from, it appears, the rest of the world, the Chinese, through their various aid programs, which we've shut down, now have 130 countries with which they are working and increasing their standards of living through their Belt and Road Initiative and so on. So help us through this question.
So let me just make 2 points, I think, building on some of what Scott said. One is even with a kind of retrenchment, maybe in some forms of soft power, it's still the case that the alliances and different partners that the United States have make it extraordinarily strong globally. I was listening to a recent interview with the great Russian historian Stephen Kotkin. He pointed out that roughly since the end of the 19th century, America has had about 5% of the globe's population and about 20% of its GDP. And this has been remarkably consistent, for a century at least. What's changed, he points out, is the kind of rivals. Like in China, has a much greater percentage of both of those measures of rough measures of power than the Soviet Union had. But when you consider, the allies and partners that the United States has, our position improves, I think, considerably. So to my mind, if you think about the way that American interests are promoted in Europe by NATO partners, in the Middle East by partners like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then in the Indo-Pacific by Japan, South Korea, Australia, the position of the United States starts to look really quite strong, even if we have the withdrawal of soft power in various forms, in other parts of the globe. So that's, I think, an important thing to have on the table with allies. The second thing I'll say about, because you asked about these countries that are in some way between the United States and China, is that one thing that the sorts of, sources that we've been talking about throughout our conversation, Thucydides, Gibbon, and others teach us, is that often conflicts between great powers start on the periphery, and then very quickly the periphery becomes central. So when we think about the narrative that Thucydides puts together about how the Peloponnesian War begins, it's not with an Athenian attack on Sparta or a Spartan attack on Athens. It has to do with Corcyra and Corinth, these important powers, but not the central actors in the story. This conflict spirals out of control. Similarly, Thebes gets involved in Plataean domestic politics. So I think that's an important thing to consider too, that when we're trying to navigate great powers, often things that start very small can become very big, and figuring out how to have some kind of dialogue around those issues to prevent them from causing a war that neither side really fully intends, I think is an important issue.
So, so the last question that I want to ask, and a couple of minutes each is what we would have left. America has an incredible capacity to reinvent or rebuild itself, overcome supposedly overwhelming odds to its survival, civil war being just one of them. I want to ask you, do you think that that capacity still exists? And if the result of the vote last November goes ahead and we become more nationalistic, more closed, more inward looking, do you think the odds are less that we will be able to overcome challenges as we have in the past? And I'll let you go, Scott, a couple of minutes, and then you, Hugh, can wind us through this hour.
No, I will never write the United States off. I think the genius of this country, both in terms of the structure of our government and in terms of the capacity for ingenuity and the capacity for recognizing where we're approaching a cliff edge, and the forces that tend to bring us back. I mean, we've been to the edge of multiple cliffs in American history, and we keep pulling ourselves back. And I'm not going to make any predictions about the future. I think that's inherently problematic. But I have fundamental confidence in the United States. If we remember, what the main keys to our success over such a long period of time have been, and recognize that we've never had any moment in American history in which we have been free from the potential for grave mistakes and troubles and challenges, and we've been able to persevere, pull ourselves through, and continue to move on. So I think we need to continue to have that confidence, because so much of the answer to that question will be based on how Americans themselves answer that question. And if we sort of take this pessimistic view that the grand old days are over, then the grand old days will be over. So I think we just need to continue to remind ourselves that we've had this enduring success.
Hugh?
Yes, I share Scott's optimism, I have to say, Sarwar. So if I can return to my master, Edward Gibbon, at the end, of describing the decline and fall in the West, he asks himself the interesting question of what do we, meaning, British people in the late 18th century, learn from this example of the decline and fall of Rome. And you would expect him to say that this is the eternal pattern of history and we're going to decline and fall just like they did. After all, his first volume appears in 1776, which would seem like a very important year in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But interestingly, although he himself was intimately involved in British policy during that period, he was a member of Parliament for 1774 to 1784, roughly, friends with Lord North, he draws the opposite conclusion. He says, we modern Europeans don't have to worry about this decline and fall in the same way. And the reason he says is not because nations won't decline and fall, they may, but he says that ever since the Roman Empire, there has emerged a way of sharing civilization across different nations. So that even though individual nations might rise and fall and that sort of thing, there's still an overarching similarity, right, that keeps the overall enterprise moving forward. And that's, I think, a very hopeful insight for him to draw from his study of Roman history. It's one that we can apply not only to alliance systems, to thinking about, civilizational concerns, but also to thinking about what makes federalist systems of government like the United States, India, Germany, work. It's partly that they have different diversity, of different political groups that can each pursue different things at different times and learn from each other's success and failure. So I think that's one reason to be optimistic is reflecting on that. But if I can just end on mentioning a second reason, which is a little near and dear to my own heart, and I think Scott's too. When you teach at a place like West Point, you're just confronted with this wonderful sight every summer of 1,200 of the best young people that America has to offer, choosing to serve their country. Coming to an institution that challenges them, that claims as its like calling card, that it's going to be hard and shape their character and improve them as people. And, we have 1,200 brilliant young Americans who sign up for that every single year. When we think about our sister service academies, it's 4,000, give or take, when we think about Air Force and Navy. So I think it's very hard for someone who has the privilege of witnessing that every single academic year to be terribly pessimistic about the future of America. There's still a lot of wonderful things happening here.
Well, thank you very much for that conclusion. We've been listening to two outstanding historians from the outstanding military academy, the US Military Academy at West Point, Professor Hugh Liebert and Professor Scott Silverstone. This has been a rather unique experience for me, I can tell you, and I'm sure for our viewers. I wish we could go on, but we cannot. And I will tell you in closing from my side that there is not one visit to West Point that I have made where I do not come back refreshed and inspired and full of the same confidence that you two have, that you've just so eloquently expressed. So I want to thank both of you for taking all this time from your busy schedules to be on Polaris Live, and I hope that we will see you again. And
thank you, Sarwar.
Thank you. And so I also want to thank our global viewers. This has been another program in our series that explores the relationship, the most consequential relationship between China and the United States through a number of different visitors, guests who know a lot about the world, know a lot about both countries. And please join us again for the next Polaris Live episode. Until then, goodbye.